Welcome to Integrate Health on the Smart Lifestyle television show. This is Dr. Roger Schwelt. I'm your host, and I welcome you today. We're going to talk about light. Light, we've already talked about light previously in terms of how light can affect your sleep, circadian rhythm, and mood. Today we're going to talk about how light may actually affect a lot more than you may take it for. We're going to talk about cellular respiration. We're going to talk about mitochondria and how it affects a lot of diseases that you might not understand. So let's talk a little bit about the physiology of this. This is the cell, but if you notice in most of the cells of your body, there's these little powerhouses called mitochondria. Now, the mitochondria is very important. It's like the engine of your cell. It produces ATP or energy. And just like an engine in your car that produces locomotion and can cause heat, and heat can shut down the engine, you need a cooling system. The same thing happens with the mitochondria. The mitochondria produces something called oxidative stress. And oxidative stress threatens to damage the mitochondria if it's not dealt with on site. It produces these extremely reactive species that can damage the mitochondria, just like heat can shut down an engine. So what is the body's cooling mechanism, if you will, to take care of this? Well, if that doesn't happen, oxidative stress can lead to less optimal health. You may be dealing with less optimal health because of this very issue. Do you have inflammation, history of cancer, dementia, diabetes, learning disabilities, even autism? All of these have been linked to mitochondrial dysfunction. And so it behooves you to understand why this might be happening and what you can do about it even right now. Well, we've actually discovered that there's two ways of dealing with oxidative stress. The body has two cooling systems, if you will, one that is implemented at night and one we're finding out that may be implemented during the day. At night, we know that lack of light to the eyes is going to allow the pineal gland to secrete melatonin. Melatonin will then be secreted into the bloodstream and go into the cells and cool down reactive oxygen species or oxidative stress, because melatonin is an extremely powerful antioxidant and it mops up those oxidative stress molecules, taking care of your mitochondria at night. That's why it's so important that when you are sleeping at night, you're sleeping at the right time and it's dark to allow for this to happen. But what happens during the day when there's too much light? Well, light is going to shut down melatonin from the pineal gland, but scientists are discovering that near-infrared radiation, specifically near-infrared radiation that you get predominantly from the sun, can penetrate down into your skin and actually directly stimulate the production of melatonin, it's proposed, in the mitochondria to deal with oxidative stress during the day when you're active. So this is a paper that was published by Scott Zimmerman and Russell Ryder that looked at this very issue of melatonin and the optics of the human body. Did you know that less than 5% of your body's total melatonin is produced in the pineal gland? That's correct. Orders of magnitude more melatonin is produced in the mitochondria of the human body. This is brand new. This subcellular, they say, melatonin does not necessarily fluctuate with our circadian clock or release into the circulation system, but instead has been proposed to be consumed locally in response to the free radical density within each cell, in particular in response to near-infrared exposure. Now, if you look at the amount of energy coming from the sun, only 39% is what you can see. There is the majority of energy, specifically 54%, and specifically in this range here from 760 nanometers to 1400 nanometers, light that you cannot see with the naked eye, that is near-infrared radiation coming from the sun, which can penetrate deeply into the human body and stimulate the mitochondria potentially to produce this melatonin. You can see here that as the wavelength gets longer, its ability to penetrate deep down into the skin becomes more possible. You understand this implicitly. When you pull up to a stoplight and those teenagers pull up next to you playing that thing they call music, what do you hear? You hear the low frequency boom, boom, boom. It's because that has the power to penetrate not only their car, but your car and vibrate your steering wheel. That has the potential to go very, very deep. You can see here, even into the subcutaneous layers. Here's a study that they published in that paper showing you that near infrared, whether you are melanin rich or melanin deficient, black skin or white skin, can penetrate, they measured up to 8 centimeters deep. That's very deep into the human body in terms of that. In fact, we use this today. Nurses in the hospital use this. Here is visible light hand. You cannot see the veins very well, but here under near infrared light at 810 nanometers, you can see the veins. Why? It's because that light is penetrating deep into the body and it's reflecting back except where the veins are absorbing that light. You can see the veins much better, and that allows the nurse to put the IV in where she needs to. Here's a graph looking at the number of cells in the human body as you get older from 0 to 80, and you can see in black the total number of cells in the human body. What is represented in red is the amount of cells that are potentially accessible to this near-infrared light from the sun. You can see in this case, it's the majority of those cells. This is actually mind-blowing, quite literally, is what they are proposing is that near-infrared light, because of its ability to penetrate, can actually penetrate the bone of your skull. Let me say that again. It can penetrate your head, illuminate the cerebral spinal fluid that is surrounding your brain, and then these, what we call sulci in the brain, will then collect the near-infrared radiation and reflect it down into the crevices so that the mitochondria in the gray matter of the brain will get the benefit of that near-infrared radiation and protect the mitochondria in your brain to make sure that you don't get dementia. You can actually see here, they're demonstrating this here ex vivo, or basically outside of the body in brain. Now, this sounded quite strange to me, the fact that we could actually have light penetrate a skull. Check this out. We actually do this in medical school to check the sinuses. We shine a light here on the frontal sinus, and notice that the frontal sinus in dark will completely light up. That's light penetrating through the skin, through the skull, lighting up the sinus, and then reflecting back at us. You can see that sinus right there. It's penetrating. Here's another way of looking at it here. Light on the maxillary sinus goes through, lights up, and we can see lighting up inside on the roof of the mouth. So this is something that visible light can do. Just imagine what near infrared, which has a much more ability to penetrate, can do. And so when we look at this, we can see that near infrared radiation from the sun is extremely important. But it gets even better than that, because you can see here that when we look at the sun spectrum, yes, there is a certain amount of energy in the near infrared spectrum, but this is really interesting, is when you go outside and when you are particularly surrounded by green trees and grass and leaves, those green trees, grass, and leaves are specifically able to reflect near infrared light even more than you would get from the sun. And so you can see the spectrum here from green leaves, it's even higher. And so here's the point. People who live in green spaces, go outside in green environments, are getting even more near infrared radiation than you would get, for instance, if you lived in a concrete jungle of the city. And so that's really important. So here, for instance, is a photograph taken with a near infrared filter. Okay, notice what you see here. This is not winter. This is in a normal day. And you can see here that almost all of the leaves are bright white. Why is that? Because they are reflecting near infrared radiation to you. How do you feel near infrared radiation? How do you know that it can penetrate? Think about this. You go outside on a bright and sunny day, only wearing a t-shirt, and you can close your eyes, but you can tell as you move around what side of your body is facing the sun. Why is that? You don't have eyes on your body. Your eyes are closed. You can feel that sun penetrating through your clothes and penetrating through your skin, and it's activating the heat receptors deep down in your skin. Why is that? That's because of near infrared radiation. And you can see the same thing happening here. On a bright day outside in the light, you're getting plenty of near infrared radiation, which is very, very beneficial. Here's another picture here of Central Park. Notice that the buildings are very dark. They do not reflect near infrared. Again, this is a near infrared filter. Notice that the trees and the leaves are very good at getting light, specifically near infrared radiation. And what is the benefits of this? We're going to talk about this in the second half, but for right now, let's take a little bit of a break. Let's take a breather. We've gone through a lot of information. And as we do that, I want to introduce my brother, who's going to play for us a little bit of an interlude on the piano at this time. Welcome back again, your host, Dr. Roger Schwelt. And we were talking about near-infrared radiation and its effects on the human body. We can see here clearly that when you go outside, you're getting a tremendous benefit in terms of near-infrared radiation, which we'll talk about. You don't get that inside of your home. The LED lights that we are now replacing our bulbs with give off almost no near-infrared radiation. We'll talk about that. And the windows that we're putting into our new construction are specifically designed to block near-infrared radiation so that excess money is not used on excessively cooling down buildings. So this is something that you need to do and get outside. And what is the data? What is the data on people who tend to live and be outside? Well, this is a study that was published in Environmental Research. The study is The Health Benefits of the Great Outdoors, a systematic review and meta-analysis of green space exposure and health outcomes. And here's a quote from this paper that was published back in 2018. We found that spending time in or living close to natural green spaces is associated with diverse and significant health benefits. Now listen to the list here. It reduces the risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, premature death, preterm birth, and increases sleep duration. People living closer to nature also had reduced diastolic blood pressure, heart rate, and stress. In fact, one of the really interesting things we found is that exposure to green space significantly reduces people's levels of salivary cortisol, a physiological marker of stress. So you see, folks, a lot of these diseases were the same diseases that we discussed had to do with mitochondrial dysfunction. Is it possible that near-infrared radiation is the answer, is the thing that explains why this is happening? Well, it could very well be, because there are studies that were published back in 2017 that showed that near-infrared radiation caused vessel relaxation from the release of nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a well-studied molecule that has multiple vascular benefits in people, and that was studied. This is a table that I basically copied out of a PhD student's dissertation on education. Do you know, folks, that we have had standards in education for the last 100 years about how, when we build schools, how big the windows in those schools need to be? Why is that? Because we have known for decades, maybe even more than 100 years, that students, when they are learning, need natural light. And they need natural light to do well in school. Well, this actually shows this. I mean, this is a table showing the benefit of daylighting on students. And you can see here that things that are improved, multiple areas of health, multiple areas of psychological health, multiple areas of learning achievement. And what is reduced? Bad things that you would not want to have, like headaches, cancers, stomach ulcers, high blood pressure, stress, microbes. Even the need for security and violent behavior goes down when you improve with more natural light. And we can see here the source of this table. There was an interesting study that was done recently. This was published back in 2019, right before the pandemic, where they took two cities, and one in the Netherlands and the other one in Oxfordshire, the UK, and they did something very interesting. They had them draw blood, and they checked their blood for glucose metabolism and lipid metabolism. But they did one thing that was very interesting. They were submitting their blood samples all throughout the year, but what they did was they took the date that they submitted their blood sample, and they looked at the previous 7 days and looked at the weather pattern, and they looked at the number of sunny days in that 7-day period of time. Do you know that they correlated better glucose metabolism scores and better lipid metabolism scores when there was more sunlight in the previous 7 days when they submitted their blood sample? This is very, very interesting, folks. I think we are missing out. But you say, wait, Dr. Schwelt, what about all of this evidence that shows that too much sun exposure can cause skin cancer? Now, remember what I said earlier, that you can still wear shirts, you could even cover with long sleeves to protect you from the ultraviolet radiation, which we can see here on this graph, has the most damage-producing rays. So ultraviolet is very known for producing damage to the skin. But notice that infrared radiation has a very, very low ability to damage your DNA and to damage skin. So what you're really concerned about is avoiding ultraviolet light. And how are you able to go outside and avoid ultraviolet light? Well, let me tell you right now how to do that. Number one, most of the ultraviolet radiation that you're going to get is going to happen between 10 o'clock in the morning and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. That's number one. So if you want to avoid that, avoid going out when the sun is very high overhead. That happens because ultraviolet radiation doesn't get through our atmosphere as well as near infrared. So it needs the sun to be very high. The other thing that you can do is make sure that you wear clothing, you cover up. So ultraviolet radiation is going to have a very hard time getting through clothes. It gets blocked with that. Sunscreen, also the same sort of thing. Ultraviolet radiation doesn't get through that. But guess what, folks? Here's the good news. Whether you go out into the sun before 10 o'clock or after 2 o'clock, wear clothes, wear sunblock, near infrared has no problem getting through those kinds of barriers. But it does have a problem getting through the walls of your house or the roof of your house or the windows of your house. So the key is you've got to get outside. That's where the sunlight is. But feel free to put on sunblock, feel free to put on long sleeves, feel free to cover up. You're still going to get the benefit of near-infrared radiation. Here's a interesting, though, just interesting aspect of that. This is another paper that was published, and they looked at, is there a relationship between sun exposure and melatonin, titled Relationship Between Sun Exposure and Melanoma Risk for Tumors in Different Body Sites in a Large Case Control Study in Temperate Climate. This was 960 cases of melanoma and 513 population and 174 sibling controls. So they could control for this. And they looked at this was done in England. Notice which they found. Overall, the clearest relationship between reported sun exposure and risk was for average weekend sun exposure in warmer months, which was protective. So in other words, if you want to protect yourself from melanoma, it seems as though getting out into the sun may actually be beneficial. Here's another paper that looked at sun exposure and mortality from melanoma. This was published, this was with 528 subjects who already had melanoma, and they wanted to know which risk factors were associated with increased death and which things were associated with decreased death. Interestingly, solar elastosis, which is sun damage, was actually shown to be associated with decreased death. This was published way back in 2005. But I think this is probably one of the best studies. This was looking in Caucasians in southern Sweden. This is known as the Southern Sweden Study. Almost 30,000 women selected at random from 35 to 64 years of age in southern Sweden, followed prospectively for 20 years. And so over that period of time, 2,500 deaths occurred, and they asked in multiple ways about their sunbathing techniques, their sunbathing behavior. And notice what they showed, that if you looked at overall survival, the ones that survived the highest, this dotted line, had the most active sun exposure, whereas those on the lower survival, the solid line, had sun-avoiding exposure. And those are long-term follow-up here. So, what seems to be the result of that? It seems as though that sun exposure may actually be beneficial, but I think we can do it in a responsible way so that we're not inviting UV damage to our skin. We can cover up, we can go into the shade, we're still going to get the benefit, especially if we're living in green environments. Okay, what about dementia? So this is really interesting. We know that multiple sclerosis, which of course is a neurodegenerative disorder, gets worse as you go up in latitude, as you go up and away from the equator, as you get less sunlight exposure. What did they find here? They found that when they looked at brain volume in multiple sclerosis subjects, that those people that had the highest sun exposure had the largest gray matter volume, and those, again, that had the most sun exposure had the largest white matter or whole brain volume, okay? But not just in multiple sclerosis patients, but also in controls. You can see the general trend here is that the more exposure you had to the sun, perhaps, again, going back to what we talked about, that the near-infrared radiation is penetrating the skull, being diffused by the cerebral spinal fluid and directed down into the crevices of your brain where your gray matter is, and that is allowing those cells to do what they need to do and making sure that they're not involuting and degrading and being destroyed, that sun exposure may actually be beneficial. It seems, at least structurally, that it seems to be better in both MS and control patients. So the effect of transcranial near-infrared light. This is another study that was published at 1068 nanometers, that's the wavelength, upon memory performance in an aging, healthy individual. So here, what they did was they actually beamed in from a laser near-infrared radiation. And of the 27 participants who completed the study and the follow-up assessments, 14 were in the treatment group and 13 were in the placebo group. In the treatment group, the researchers identified statistically significant improvements in the following categories. So those that got near-infrared radiation: overall performance, mathematical processing, working memory, delayed memory, and tapping the right hand in motor function. These are in patients who are aging, healthy individuals. So there was actually improvement in memory in elderly patients who are getting near-infrared radiation. So, folks, we've talked about before about the need to get out into the sun when the sun is up, and the need to make sure that you're not looking at light when the sun is down. And I find it interesting that we are now finding out the statistics and the details and the pathophysiology of this, but there seems to have been some information that people seem to have known this a long time ago. Here I quote from a very notable health reformer that published this back in the 1800s. She writes here, "The feeble one should press out into the sunshine as earnestly and naturally as do the shaded plants and vines. The pale and sickly grain blade that has struggled up out of the cold of early spring puts out the natural and healthy deep green after enjoying for a few days the health and life-giving rays of the sun. Go out into the light and warmth," she says, warmth of the glorious sun, you pale and sickly ones, and share with vegetation its life-giving, health-dealing power. That's the health reformer, May 1st, 1871. And then Ellen G. White, who published that letter, wrote to her secretary in terms of light after 9 o'clock. She says, "Make it a habit not to sit up after 9 o'clock. Every light should be extinguished. This turning night into day is a wretched, health-destroying habit." So it seems as though people knew this over 100 years ago, and I think now we're starting to figure out why this is the case. So, folks, how do humans interact with light? There is light that goes into the eye that affects the sleep, circadian rhythm, and mood. We talked about sleep and the suprachiasmatic nucleus. We've talked about how it's very important in the morning to get up, to get outside, to start to arrange your day in a way that you start to expose your eyes to light that is outside. Again, we've talked about this. On a bright, sunny day in the morning outside, you're getting over 100,000 lux. You can very quickly get the needed 3,000 lux hours that you need to get your circadian rhythm in the right place. But at the same time, mood also helps as well, because when you're exposing your eyes to that bright light in the morning, it's stimulating that perihabenular nucleus that we talked about in a previous lecture where we talked about mood and its connection to light. So there's a lot of people that can have seasonal affective disorder, and this is a problem. So getting out in the morning is really important. But the also other thing that you're doing is when you get out in the morning, you're allowing that near-infrared radiation to penetrate deep down into your body. So those cells can start to build up melatonin for the day to protect those mitochondria from the oxidative stress onslaught that they are about to get as you go throughout the day. Thinking about this. Think about you're about to start your car in the morning, and what you're doing is you're checking the oil to make sure that the oil is the right level, to make sure that there's enough water or coolant in the radiator. You want to make sure that your car is ready to go, because here's the problem, and we'll talk about this in a subsequent lecture, is if your car has a tendency to overheat, if you're not getting enough melatonin, if you're staying up late at night and you're not getting the benefit of melatonin, or you're not getting out early in the day, or you're overworking, you're not getting enough sleep, your car, if you will, is going to be apt to overheat. And so the problem is that if you encounter a very steep hill in your drive, you're going to be at risk of burning out on the way up that hill. And that hill can be a number of things. It can be diabetes. It could be a pandemic like coronavirus. And you can see very clearly how when we are not optimally settled into our health, that when these stresses come along, our body is not going to deal with that stress in a very good way. So it's important. What is it that we can do? Get as much natural sunlight, direct or indirect, as possible, avoiding the glass in between within reason after waking up. Exposure to low-level red light, fire, sunset at sunset time is advisable. Remember that not only does the sun give off near-infrared radiation, but fire does as well. And avoid any type of light exposure after sunset, especially blue light, and especially 1 to 2 hours before bedtime. Folks, we have talked about light and its importance. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in an upcoming lecture where we talk about COVID and sunshine and how this might be beneficial. So until that time, thank you for joining us. Again, I'm Dr. Roger Schwelt signing off for Integrate Health. Join us at Smart Lifestyle, that's sls-tv.com. Thanks for joining us.